The night before her wedding in 1992, Lillian Hayes vanished, and suspicion immediately fell upon her fiancé. But for the next 25 years, the real killer brought flowers to her mother, attended every memorial, and played the part of the family's most trusted friend. He made only one mistake. He hid a single damning clue, not in the earth, not in the water, but inside the hem of a wedding dress he was certain would be forgotten in an attic. How did a sister's simple decision to wear that same dress decades later unmask a psychopath who had been hiding in their arms all along? The day before the world fractured, on October 15, 1992, the Hayes family home in Maple Creek, Vermont, was a universe of warmth against the crisp autumn air. It smelled of cinnamon from apple pies cooling on the counter and of fresh pine from garlands draped over the doorways. It was a house buzzing with the final, frantic, joyous energy that only the eve of a wedding can create. At the center of it all was 24-year-old Lillian Hayes. To her younger sister Amelia, Lily wasn't just a bride, she was an architect of beauty. A botanist by trade, she had a way of making everything around her feel more alive. As Amelia watched her sister arrange the final bouquet of wildflowers, she felt a familiar swell of admiration. Lily was her compass, the person who made the future feel not like a scary, unknown territory, but like a sunlit garden waiting to be explored. Amelia thought tomorrow was the first day of her sister's perfect life. Later, the groom, Mark, and his best man, Julian Vance, arrived with a last-minute gift. Julian was more than just Mark's best friend. He was a fixture in the Hayes home, an adopted son. With a charming smile, he presented a small gift to Lily before turning to her mother and Amelia. He placed a hand over his heart, making a sincere promise of lifelong friendship, assuring them he would always be there to look after the family, no matter what. At the time, it sounded like a vow of loyalty. No one could know it was a claim. The evening ended in a soft glow of contentment. Lily hugged her mother and then turned to Amelia in the upstairs hallway for their final exchange. A simple good night, with the promise of a tomorrow that would never come. Morning arrived on October 16th, sharp and beautiful. The perfect day for a wedding. But the house was too quiet. An unnatural stillness had replaced the buzz of the day before. By 9 a.m., a knot of confusion began to tighten in the family's stomach. When Amelia pushed open her sister's bedroom door, she found it pristine. The bed was perfectly made, as if it hadn't been slept in. A cold breeze drifted in from a slightly open window. Her mother's first thought was nerves, a hope that Lily had simply gone for a walk to clear her head. But Amelia saw the one thing that screamed this was wrong: the wedding dress. It hung on the front of the antique wardrobe, magnificent, untouched, a silent, waiting ghost. Lily would never have left without it. The sight of the dress, expectant and abandoned, was the first true wave of panic. It was a cold, physical thing, stealing the air from the room. The sounds of the house, frantic calls to the groom, the cheerful ring of the telephone, all began to sound distant as if happening underwater. A silent, desperate no echoed in Amelia's mind. Her sister had to be there, but she wasn't. An hour later, the first police car pulled into the driveway. It's flashing. Blue and red lights splashed across the windows, painting the happy floral arrangements in colors of emergency and dread. The wedding day had become a crime scene, and the beautiful future everyone had gathered to celebrate had just been stolen, leaving behind nothing but a deafening silence and an empty white dress. The initial days bled into weeks of frantic, hopeful searching. Volunteers combed the dense Vermont woods, police divers explored the icy depths of nearby lakes, and Lillian's smiling face stared out from missing person posters tacked to every telephone pole and storefront window in Maple Creek. The investigation, fueled by the pressure of a bride, vanished, quickly zeroed in on the man she was supposed to marry. Her fiancé, Mark, was questioned for hours, his life and the life of his family dissected under a harsh public microscope. He had an alibi, but it was his word against 1,000 whispered theories. The town that was meant to host his wedding instead hosted his trial by suspicion. It was Julian Vance, the best man, who offered another theory, one steeped in what seemed like a deep, loving understanding of Lily. He suggested to the police that Lily was a romantic, a free spirit, and that perhaps the overwhelming pressure of a perfect wedding had simply been too much, that she had run away to find herself, never intending for such a fuss. The idea, born from the mouth of a trusted friend, took root. It softened the terrifying edges of a potential abduction or murder, replacing it with the more palatable, albeit still painful, narrative of a runaway bride. And in doing so, it subtly shifted the focus, clouding the waters of the investigation in its most crucial early days. But as the weeks turned to months and the months to years, all theories withered away, leaving only a cold, hard absence. The posters faded and were torn down. The police leads dried up. Lillian Hayes's case was officially moved from active to cold, a thick file in a metal cabinet, a ghost story whispered by the town's children. For the Hayes family, however, there was no such thing as a cold case. It was a wound that remained perpetually open. The seasons in Maple Creek turned again and again. Fall would arrive each year, not with a sense of beauty, but as a grim anniversary, the air thick with the memory of loss. The once vibrant Hayes home grew quiet, insulated by a grief that had become its foundation. Lily's parents aged, the light in their eyes dimming, their hope eroding into a silent, stoic endurance. And Amelia, the 20-year-old maid of honor, remained. She stayed in the town that was the epicenter of her pain, as if leaving would be a betrayal, a final acceptance that her sister was never coming back. Her youth evaporated, replaced by a quiet vigilance, a life lived in the long, dark shadow of 1992. She was there when her father passed away from a heart attack, a decade after the disappearance, a man her mother insisted had died of. A broken heart. At the funeral, Amelia watched Julian Vance, ever present, supporting her grieving mother, his face a perfect mask of sorrow. And Amelia felt the sharp, specific emptiness beside her, the space where Lily should have been, the one person who would have known exactly what to say. The loss was not a single event. It was a continuous, daily subtraction. Throughout these 25 years, Julian was their rock. He was the keeper of Lily's memory, the one who organized the annual candlelight vigil at the town square on the anniversary of her disappearance. He would stand before the small crowd, his voice thick with emotion, and speak of Lily's kindness, her light. He was the son Lily's parents had lost in a way, the friend Amelia could lean on. He embedded himself so deeply into the architecture of their sorrow that his presence became essential. It was a performance of grief so perfect, so unwavering, that no one ever thought to question it. No one noticed that his sorrow, unlike theirs, never changed, never deepened, never showed the ragged edges of true unending loss. It was a constant, polished tribute. By 2017, Amelia was 45. Life, in its persistent way, had moved forward. She had met a kind man, a patient man who understood the quiet sadness she carried. When she agreed to marry him, it was not with the explosive joy she had witnessed in her sister, but with a tentative, fragile hope. It was a step toward her own life, a life she had postponed for a quarter of a century, and in an act of tribute, a way to have her sister with her, she decided she would wear her mother's vintage wedding dress. One afternoon, she went alone into the quiet chill of the attic and lifted the heavy lid of the old cedar chest, entirely unaware that she was about to touch not just the past, but the very key to its violent, hidden truth. The local tailor shop in Maple Creek was a quiet place, smelling of chalk, old fabric, and hot steam. In 2017, Amelia brought the heavy garment bag inside, her heart a mix of reverence and trepidation. The dress, her mother's wedding dress, was more than just silk and lace. It was a relic of a time before the fracture, a symbol of a happiness she was only now tentatively reaching for herself. The tailor, an older woman with wise hands and decades of experience, laid the dress carefully across a large table, her fingers tracing the delicate beadwork with professional admiration. As she began to measure for alterations, her hands paused at the hemline. She ran her fingers over it again, her brow furrowed in concentration. It was too thick, too rigid. There was an unnatural weight to it, a stiffness that didn't belong in the gentle drape of the fabric. She looked at Amelia, her expression one of professional curiosity. She explained that something seemed to be sealed within the hem, perhaps an old waiting piece from a bygone era of dressmaking, and suggested it would be best to open the seam. With Amelia's hesitant nod, the tailor took a small, sharp seam ripper and began to carefully snip the original threads, each snap echoing loudly in the silent room. She worked slowly, meticulously, pulling back the heavy satin to reveal the lining beneath. There, nestled flat against the inner fabric, was a small object, skillfully sewn into its own silk pouch. It was a careful, deliberate concealment, not an accident. The tailor gently freed the pouch and handed it to Amelia, whose hands had begun to tremble. The silk was cool and smooth to the touch. Amelia unwrapped it to find a small plain tin box, slightly tarnished with age. It was a simple thing, like a box for mints or pills. It felt cold, heavy. For a moment, she could only stare at it, 1,000 questions with no answers swirling in her mind. With a deep breath, she pried open the lid. Inside, resting on faded cotton, were 2 items: a single ornate silver cufflink with a unique V engraving, and a small letter folded into a tight square, its paper yellowed to the color of old ivory. She recognized the cufflink instantly. It was Julian's. She had seen him wear the pair 100 times over the years, at dinners, holidays, and memorials. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, began to creep up her spine as she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was his too, unmistakably. Her eyes scanned the page. The elegant, slanted script, a horrifying contrast to the words themselves. The letter began as a desperate, poetic plea, speaking of undying love and a stolen destiny, but the tone quickly warped, the words twisting into a dark obsession. It spoke of his rightful place at her side, of her beauty being his discovery, his possession. The final lines, scrawled with a heavier pressure, made the air leave her body. "You have made your choice, and it is the wrong one," it read. "You were meant to be my life, my future. If I can't have your future, Lillian, no one will." The world in the small tailor shop tilted on its axis. The gentle hum of the sewing machines faded into a dull roar in her ears. 25 years of memories flashed through her mind, each one now poisoned by this new, horrific context. Every comforting word from Julian, every supportive gesture, every tear he shed for Lily was a lie, a monstrous, calculated performance. As Amelia sat frozen, the narrator's voice can explain the logic of a psychopath. This was not a mistake. This was a trophy. In his supreme and malignant arrogance, Julian Vance had needed a shrine for his secret victory. He chose the one object that was the very heart of the family's hope, a wedding dress, and desecrated it with his truth. He was certain it would be preserved forever, an icon of grief no one would dare touch, let alone alter. It was the perfect hiding place, a constant private monument to his power, tucked away in an attic where he could be sure his secret was safe. The thought that another wedding, Amelia's wedding, would ever bring it back into the light was a possibility his narcissism could never have conceived. The dress was no longer a symbol of hope for Amelia. It was a tomb, and the small tin box in her hands was no longer just a curiosity. It was evidence. Its weight was no longer measured in ounces, but in the crushing absolute gravity of a quarter-century of betrayal. Walking into the Maple Creek police station was like stepping back into the worst day of her life. The building was renovated, the computers were new, but the air still felt heavy with failure. Amelia clutched the strap of her bag, the small tin box inside feeling like a lead weight. She was met not by the overwhelmed officers of her memory, but by the calm, professional eyes of Detective Isabella Rossi, the head of the county's new cold case unit. Rossi, a sharp, empathetic woman in her late 30s, led Amelia to a quiet interview room, a place devoid of the frantic energy Amelia remembered from 1992. Amelia placed the tin box on the cool metal table. With a voice that trembled but did not break, she recounted the story of the dress, the tailor, and the discovery. And then came the hardest part. When Detective Rossi asked who she believed had hidden it, Amelia had to force the name past her lips, a name that felt like a betrayal to even speak in this context. She told them the handwriting, the cufflink, belonged to Julian Vance, a man who, for all public purposes, was a pillar of their small community, and for all private purposes, was family. The detectives listened, their expressions giving nothing away, but they understood the gravity of the accusation. This was not a random tip. This was a tangible artifact, a voice from the past found in an impossible place. Within hours, the 25-year-old file on the disappearance of Lillian Hayes was officially reopened. The box, the letter, and the cufflink were carefully packaged and sent to the state crime lab, setting in motion a forensic investigation that would have been science fiction in 1992. For Amelia, the days that followed were a surreal limbo. A part of her, conditioned by decades of disappointment, expected nothing to come of it, but another part of her felt a terrifying, unfamiliar flicker of something that resembled hope. The first results from the lab came back within a week, the fingerprints preserved in the airtight, stable environment of the box, and on the letter were clear and indisputable. They were a perfect match for Julian Vance. Then came the second. Confirmation. Old family photos pulled from the dusty case file showed Julian at a Christmas party in 1991, smiling, with the matching cufflink glinting on his wrist. But the final, irrefutable piece of evidence was the one that broke the case wide open. Using modern DNA techniques, the lab was able to isolate a trace amount of saliva from the seal of the small envelope that held the letter. The DNA profile was conclusive. It belonged to Lillian Hayes. This was the shockwave. It proved that Lily had held this letter, that Julian's obsessive, threatening words had reached her on or near the day she vanished. It annihilated any possibility that this was just an unsent fantasy from a spurned lover. Detective Rossi delivered the news to Amelia in person. It was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, sickening horror. The scientific facts dismantled 25 years of her reality, memory by memory. His hand on her shoulder at her father's funeral. Was it comfort? Or was it the chilling touch of a predator confirming his secret was safe? The concerned calls, the shared tears, the endless kindness, all of it was reframed as a grotesque, masterful deception. He hadn't been sharing their grief. He had been feeding on it. The man who had been her family's rock was, without a doubt, the prime suspect in her sister's murder. Back at the station, the old evidence board was wiped clean. In the center, Detective Rossi pinned the smiling, hopeful face of Lillian Hayes from 1992. And next to it, she pinned a recent photograph of Julian Vance, a respected man, a friend to all, smiling at a charity event. The ghost of the past now had a face. The shadow that had lingered for a quarter of a century now had a name. And the hunt had officially begun. The new investigation moved with a speed the original had lacked. Detectives Rossi and Miller began building a psychological profile of Julian Vance, re-examining every witness statement from 1992 through the new, damning lens of him as a suspect. They re-interviewed Amelia, asking her to walk through the events of those first few days one more time. As she spoke, the new context caused old, dormant memories to surface with a sickening clarity. She remembered standing in her living room, numb with shock, as Julian helpfully suggested to the original investigators his theory of Lily being a runaway bride. She recounted this to Detective Rossi, her voice low with the horror of the realization. It wasn't a friend, trying to make sense of a tragedy. It was a killer planting a false narrative. He had been actively steering the investigation from the very beginning, laying a false trail while the real one grew cold. For the detectives, this was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It established a pattern not of grief, but of calculated criminal misdirection. Armed with this, they brought Julian Vance in for questioning. He arrived not with a lawyer, but with an air of weary cooperation, the concerned citizen, ready to assist the police in clearing up this tragic misunderstanding. He sat across from Rossi and Miller, his posture relaxed, his expression one of polite concern. He was not a suspect. He was a man above suspicion. When they presented him with the letter, he did not deny it. Instead, he smiled sadly, a well-practiced look of wistful remembrance. He admitted to writing it, dismissing it as the overly dramatic prose of a heartbroken young man. He painted a masterful picture for them, one of a deep yet platonic love for Lily, and how he poured his unrequited feelings onto a page in a moment of youthful melodrama. He claimed he had given it to her days before the wedding, and that they had even shared a private, gentle laugh about his intensity. He was, he implied, simply guilty of having too much heart. He was in complete control, the seasoned performer giving the encore of his life. The detectives let him talk, letting him spin his web, letting him build the fictional stage on which his innocence played out. Detective Rossi pushed for details. "Tell us about that afternoon, Julian, when you gave her the letter." Confident he was outsmarting them, Julian obliged. He described a fictional meeting in a local park, the crisp autumn leaves, the sad smile on Lily's face as she tucked the letter away, a memento of his deep friendship. He was building his alibi brick by brick. Then, Detective Rossi leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm, still conversational. "That's a very clear memory, Julian, thank you." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "It's interesting, because the letter you wrote mentions her planning to wear a blue dress for the wedding dance." Julian nodded, a confident smile playing on his lips. "Yes, she looked beautiful in blue." "She did," Rossi agreed. "But Lily only decided to wear that blue dress on the night she vanished. It was a last-minute change after her final fitting. She mentioned it to only one person on the phone that evening, her sister Amelia. So I need you to tell me, Julian, how did you know about a dress she had only decided to wear hours before she disappeared, if you supposedly gave her the letter days before?" Silence. For the first time in the interview in 25 years, the performance stopped. The easy, charming smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and a flicker of something cold, pure, unfiltered panic flashed in his eyes before being suppressed. His posture, once relaxed and confident, became rigid. The mask of the grieving friend, so perfectly maintained for a quarter of a century, had cracked. He had been caught in an impossible, irreversible lie, trapped by a detail he could not have known. The detectives in the room knew it, and more importantly, Julian Vance knew it too. The game was over. In the stark quiet of the interrogation room, the collapse was total. Julian Vance's carefully constructed world, built over 25 years of meticulous lies, had been demolished by the memory of a blue dress. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind the empty, hollowed-out shell of a man whose performance was finally over. With his timeline shattered, the true and brutal story of Lillian Hayes's final hours came to light. He had not gone to the Hayes house that night to kill her. In his mind, he had gone there to save her. Fueled by a narcissistic self-delusion, he believed a final, grand appeal from him, the man who truly loved her, would be enough to make her see the colossal mistake she was making. He slipped into the quiet house after her parents were asleep and found her in her room. He confronted her not with anger, but with the letter, his ultimate testament of love, his final poetic plea. Lily, kind and gentle to the very end, did not react with anger or fear. She read his words and, with a deep sadness in her eyes, rejected him. She told him she loved him, but as a brother, a cherished friend. She was firm but compassionate, and that compassion was the trigger. For a narcissist like Julian, a gentle, pitying rejection is infinitely more enraging than a hateful one. It denied him his power, his drama. The kindness was a lit match to his gunpowder ego. The violence that followed was not planned. It was a sudden, ugly explosion of rage, a storm of pure, narcissistic fury unleashed upon the woman who had dared to show him pity instead of adoration. In a few brief, horrific moments, his obsession curdled into murder. The silence that followed was broken only by his own panicked breathing. The cover-up began. He staged the room, opening the window to suggest an escape. Under the cover of darkness, he took her from the home she loved. And then, in a final act of possessive audacity before he left, he returned to her mother's room, found the vintage wedding dress, and with a needle from a sewing kit, stitched his trophy, his confession, his last message to Lily, into the hem. It was his secret altar, at the heart of the life he had just destroyed. The next morning he was one of the first to call, his voice laced with practiced concern. He became the rock, the shoulder to cry on, the grieving friend. The narrator's voice now describes the present day. Julian Vance, a quiet and defeated 50-year-old man, is formally charged with the murder of Lillian Hayes. There is no struggle. The charisma he wore for decades has evaporated, revealing nothing underneath. As the news breaks, Detective Rossi sits with Amelia and tells her everything. She explains the confrontation, the rejection, and the pathetic, rage-filled motive. For Amelia, this is not closure. It is a second, more profound trauma. She finally has the answer to what happened to her sister, but now she is faced with the horrifying how. How could this man, the man who held her hand at her father's funeral, be the one who caused all their pain? Every shared memory was now a scene from a horror film in which she was an unwitting participant. The years of comfort he provided were not acts of kindness. They were acts of continued violation, a predator returning to the scene of the crime again and again to admire his work. He hadn't just taken Lily's life. He had infiltrated and corrupted the sacred process of their family's grief, turning their love and trust into fuel for his own monstrous ego. The greatest evil they had ever known wasn't a stranger who had crept in through a window. It was a man they had willingly let in through the front door for 25 years. The true face of the monster was the familiar face of a friend. The trial of Julian Vance was not long. Faced with irrefutable DNA evidence and the collapse of his own timeline, the man who had maintained a lie for a quarter of a century remained silent. He was found guilty of the murder of Lillian Hayes and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The law had delivered its final, belated judgment. For his crime, Julian was given a small room of concrete and steel. It was a stark contrast to the prison of unending grief to which he had sentenced the entire Hayes family. For Mark, the fiancé who had been tried and convicted in the court of public opinion, the verdict was a quiet, hollow vindication that could never give him back the life he lost. And for Amelia, the end of the trial was not an ending. The reporters left, the town's shock subsided, and she was left in the quiet aftermath, holding the terrible answer she had sought for most of her life. The world wants to call this closure, a neat and tidy word for a wound that can never truly close. But for Amelia, it was something far more complex. The agonizing void of uncertainty had been filled, but it was filled with the horror of the truth. She was no longer haunted by a question, but burdened by the answer. She now had to learn how to live in a world where she knew, with absolute certainty, the face of the monster who had sat at her dinner table. Several months later, on a cool spring morning, a small crowd gathered not for a wedding but for a different kind of ceremony. On a small plot of land donated by the town, the Lillian Hayes Memorial Garden was being dedicated. At its center was Amelia. She was not crying. Her expression was one of purpose, of calm resolve. She knelt in the soft earth, and with her own hands, she planted the first seeds, a rare species of lily, the same one her sister had been trying to cultivate years ago. She was no longer Amelia Hayes, the sister of the vanished bride. She was the woman who had unearthed a terrible truth and chosen not to let it be the final word. By planting these seeds, she was ensuring that her sister's legacy was not one of a victim, but of the botanist she was always meant to be. She was choosing to cultivate life from a place of death, to create beauty where there had only been ugliness. The story of Lillian Hayes is a painful reminder that the deepest truths are sometimes buried not in the ground, but in the places we hold most sacred, and that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones who know our names. Our mission here is to ensure that these echoes from the past are not lost to the silence, honoring the legacy of the victims and the perseverance of those who never stop searching for answers. If you believe these journeys of resilience deserve to be heard, and that no victim should be forgotten, join our community of storytellers by subscribing to the channel. Leave a like to help this story reach more people, and share in the comments. What detail of this 25-year-long deception shocked you the most?